Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Women in Public Policy Program's research seminar that is co-sponsored by the Radcliffe Institute here at Harvard University. My name is Iris Bonnet. I'm on the faculty here at the Kennedy School and the co-director of the Women in Public Policy Program. You're part of the seminar series that focuses on making work fair. And today we are incredibly delighted to welcome Professor Nicholas Bloom, who is going to be presenting the glorious future of working from home, which truly sounds glorious to me as well. So Nick is the William Eberle Professor of Economics at Stanford. He previously worked at the UK Treasury and McKinsey Company and the IFC. He will be presenting work, related to chapter 10 of the book. I know some of you are reading along on work arrangements to level the playing field in Make Work Fair. As is typically the case, the presenter will talk for about half of our time, and then we will open to questions. If you have any questions beforehand, particularly clarifying questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if appropriate, I might intervene, Nick, and just ask you a question or two during your presentation. But otherwise, Nick is incredibly excited about taking your questions, engaging with people from all backgrounds, academia, practice, human resources management, wherever you are currently located. And on that front, I'm going to turn it over to Nick. Thanks again for joining us.
Great. Thanks very much, Iris. Thank you for having me on. I should say I'm very happy to share the slides. Actually, as soon as I finish talking, I'll post them in the chat there. I'm an academic, so they're free to share and download. But without any more delay, why don't I go through? So I'm going to talk about the glorious future of working from home. Some photos, I'll come back to it, but both of this is some pictures of data I've been using on in-office and working from home. So I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes. I'll leave about the remaining kind of half an hour for Q&A. But yes, as Iris said, if there are any burning questions during, I'm more than happy to take them. So I'll talk firstly just data. So where are we on work from home? And I'll argue the media is kind of misrepresenting. I mean, I'll come on to it, but put it this way. It's easy to get an incorrect expectation of what's going on from the media, and I'll show you that hard data. Secondly, I talk about briefly some thoughts on how to manage it for anyone out there, Chief Human Resource Officers, CPOs, managers. And then finally, 4 economic impacts, including a couple that are very gender related. So currently, first thing, where are we? Well, if you read the news, you will get the sense that work from home is over. So top left, this is from the New York Times, September 2023, reported that work from home is over in Zoom, or at least there's been a big return to the office. I actually know Zoom reasonably well. I know Eric Yuan, the CEO, and talked to him a bunch. So yes, they're back to the office, but certainly not fully. A bigger shock was Amazon. So that was September 2024, about 6 months ago. That was a 5-day return to the office. It was supposed to start January this year. It's kind of got off to a bit of a mixed start. I talked to a bunch of folks in Amazon. Some are in 5 days a week, some aren't. It's, patchily enforced. And then I guess the biggest earthquake's been the federal government. So Trump, Musk, and others have been asking people to come in 5 days a week as of January this year. And happy to come back to Q&A as to why that's happening. But the big driver of this announcement is, to be honest, hoping that folks may quit because it's part of the drive to reduce headcount. So what's the data say? Forget the headlines. What do we actually see in the data? So I'm going to show you 3 different figures, and you're going to see that they're very consistent over what they show. So this is figure 1. This is survey data. There are 2 different surveys here. In blue is our own survey. So we have a group in Stanford, Chicago, and ITAM in Mexico that's surveying around 10,000 Americans a month. And in red is the US Census Bureau. The y-axis here is the share of full paid days that folks work from home. The reason we focus on full days is many people are not either fully remote or fully in person. There's a lot of hybrid workers out there, so we want to measure it on days. You can see before the pandemic, that was 7%. So before the pandemic, yes, there were folks that worked full days from home, but it was typically about once a month. It just didn't happen that often. You then see in the peak of the pandemic lockdown, so this is April, May 2020, it went to 60%. So more than half of full paid days in America from home, pretty astounding situation. It drops and drops and drops. But what I want you to focus on is look from January 2023 onwards. It's kind of flat. So yes, work from home has been falling 21, 22, through 2020, but you can see from 23 onwards, it's basically been flat. So for example, the last data is February 2025. It's very similar to the values you saw in February 2023. So work from home doesn't appear to have fallen over the last 2 years. Now, you might say this is survey data. Survey data is unrealistic. People, I don't know, they say stuff that isn't the truth. So let's look at a different data set. This is office swipe data. So this is from a company called Castle Security. They put turnstiles and swipe systems and security systems for 2,600 buildings across the US. And they provide data to say how many folks come into their offices. So you should think of what this is. This is a bunch of kind of medium and large offices across US cities. And this shows kind of in reverse, almost exactly the same story. So February 2020 was 100%. You can see March, April 2020, office attendance rates was 15% of what it was before. So people were really not coming into American offices. It was basically, IT support, security, but there was, not much else going on. You can see office attendance has been rising and rising and rising. But since early to mid 2023, it's not changed, really at all. So again, on office attendance, what we see is a similar story. People, yes, they deserted offices in early 2020. They've been slowly returning, but we're looking at now roughly only about a 50% return rate. And importantly, it hasn't changed over the last 2 years. So office attendance, survey data shows folks have stopped, returning to the office for about the last 2 years. Final data I'm going to show you is from cell phones. So, here is my cell phone here. The nice things about cell phones is Americans are never far from their cell phones. I'm guessing if I polled everyone, almost everyone has their cell phone within 6 feet of them. So, if you can track a cell phone, you can basically track a person. And this is what Placer AI does. It tracks cell phone kind of movements into more than 700 US office buildings. And again, you basically see the same thing. So yes, they benchmarked it versus February 2019. You see there's a huge drop at the beginning of the pandemic. People stopped going in. It's rising, rising, rising. But again, it seems to have flattened over the last 2 years. So big picture takeaway, yes, working from home exploded during the early period of the pandemic. Yes, it subsided, but for the last 2 years, it's been pretty stable. We have not seen a mass return to the office. Why is that? The simple reason is it's hugely profitable for firms to run hybrid and for some employees remote setup. So to explain this, I'll show you a study. So this is a study I published in Nature with 2 co-authors last summer 2024 in June. And what we did is we ran a randomized control trial or A/B test on a big company called Trip.com. So Trip.com, probably many people have used it. They're a large travel agent. They're one of the big 3 along with Expedia and Booking. They have about 40,000 employees. They're listed on NASDAQ. They're worth, about $50 billion. They are like a massive company. And I got to work with them because James Liang, who was the founding CEO, now the chairman, was my student in Stanford almost 20 years ago. So what do we do with James and Jane's son? So Jane, she's the CEO. We designed this experiment where we took 1,600 graduate employees. So these in 2 divisions. These are people in engineering, marketing, accounting, and finance. So these are very much like Harvard, Stanford, undergrads gone into their professional career. And for those 1,600 people, they randomized. And if you had an even birthday, so you were born on the 2nd, 4th, 6th, 8th, 10th of the month, you had to come in all 5 days of the week. If you had an odd birthday like me on May the 5th, you got to work from home on Wednesday and Friday. So we did an A/B test. People were randomly allocated, come in all 5 days, or do a hybrid pattern where you're in 3 days of the week in the office and on Wednesday and Friday you work from home. So he held this setup for 6 months and then collected up to 2 years of data. What did we find? So we found two things. First finding, there was no effect on performance. So it had really good performance data in the sense we had performance reviews. We had every 6 months, we had promotions, we had leadership scores, innovation scores for the coders. He had lines of code written. They had a whole raft of different performance evaluations, and they just found no impact. And in a sample of this size, 1,600 people, it was pretty precise. When you interviewed people, it kind of revealed why hybrid doesn't seem to reduce productivity versus being in the office 5 days a week. So we interviewed a lot of people and they would say, you certainly need to, value, there's certainly real value for coming in some days each week. So they'd say, look, it's really valuable for mentoring, for innovation, for building culture. But by the time you've come in 3 days a week, it's really not obvious those fourth and fifth days are particularly valuable in addition. They would say, look, we're already in 3 days a week. We're already connected up, having a lot of mentoring. Those fourth and fifth days are actually really useful because A, it's quieter at home. So it's easier to get deep work and concentrated work done. And B, each day I work from home, I'm saving about an hour and a half on total commuting and grooming time. And some of that time I spend to work more, some of it I sleep, some more rested. And so fact one is performance was not better, but it was not worse. It seemed kind of neutral. Finding two was this figure on the right, is that quit rates fell by 35%. And for the company, for Trip.com, they said every person that quits costs us about $30,000 to $50,000. So anyone that's managed, anyone that's been in HR, that's been in any teams knows that turnover is expensive. When somebody quits, you've then got to go out, you've got to re-advertise, re-interview, re-recruit, get someone up to speed, have them in the post for 6 months to a year before they get up to speed of the person that's just left. And so Trip, the C-suite, the executive suite, looked at this data and said, look, hybrid is phenomenally profitable for us. It has no effect on revenue, it has no effect on performance, but it's going to save us tens of millions of dollars a year from lowering turnover rates. And as a result, they adopted it. And that's why 80% of Fortune 500 companies have hybrid for managers and professionals. So if you want to know why hybrid is stuck and why work from home is stuck, it's basically because it's extremely profitable for firms to do this. And typically in capitalist economies, what's profitable tends to stick around. So it does vary a bit across countries. North America, so US, Canada. In fact, my homeland, you can probably tell from my accent, I'm originally from the UK, from England. Australia, New Zealand, they have higher levels. If you go to Europe, it's a little bit lower. Northern Europe's a bit higher than Southern Europe. If you go into Latin America, Africa, particularly Asia, work from home levels are lower. So I talk to a lot of multinationals and they say people are back in the office in North America, typically 50, 60%, but the Asian offices are not quite back to where they were pre-pandemic. They're pretty full. There is also huge variation by industry. So if you look at industries like finance, insurance, tech, business services, consulting, lawyers, they tend to have pretty high levels of work from home. Why? Because you're basically got graduates using computers. So it's easy for people to do that, let's say 2-3 days a week remotely. If you look down at the bottom, hospitality, food services, retail, personal services, they tend to be much lower. But it's not zero. I'll give you an anecdote. I was oddly in Las Vegas a year ago talking to a bunch of guys, a bunch of people in food services at this event. And somebody came up to me afterwards and they said, I run a chain of taco restaurants in Los Angeles and I really love working from home. And I was kind of, like, where is this going? It doesn't seem like running a taco restaurant would be, very amenable to work from home. And they said, look, the people that work in the restaurant, that cook, that clean, that tidy up, they have to, that serve the food, they have to come in every day. That there's no way that those folks can work from home. They said, look, my back office staff, I've moved my entire back office operation to fully remote. They're about, they said 80, 90% is sufficient, but maybe 50% the cost because I don't have to pay for offices and I can hire fantastic people at more competitive rates. And the owner, he said, look, I really love work from home. It's been very profitable, very, successful for my business. So if you look down at these industries here, you often see it's office employees, IT services, HR managers, etc., that maybe are working from home 1-2 days a week. So next section, yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask a quick question here?
Yeah, right.
So Martha in the Q&A was wondering a bit more about the sample, because you're just telling us about differences across industries, and her question is it all workers or just office workers? The earlier slides where you showed us the averages, I thought it was all workers, probably not just office workers, but please.
Great question. So yes, sample matters a lot. I could be nerdily into the details. I'll give you the kind of 30,000 foot version. In our US data, we sample people aged 20 to 64 that earned $10,000 or more the year before. So they're either working mostly or some of them looking for work. We actually reweight to match the current population survey. So they should be representative on gender, on age, and education and income. Within that, I haven't shown you, and I come back, there are some notable differences. So one of them, obviously for this group, there's some difference on gender. I was going to come back to that later. In the US, work from home is actually pretty gender neutral. So there's slightly higher levels for women, but the differences are not huge. You see much bigger differences on having young children at home. So men or women with children under the age of home actually have significantly higher levels of work from home. And as I'll come on to later, having a disability is a very strong predictor of it. The other thing is just in terms of the US population, 60% of people can't work from home at all. So they are, frontline service, teachers, people, nurses, people working in food service, accommodation, pilots, airline pilots. No one's very comfortable with airline pilots flying for, surgeons. There's a group of people in that group. 30% of people are hybrid. That's probably most people I suspect people listening, certainly my world at Stanford, if I look at my undergrads, my MBAs, exec ed, they're mostly in this hybrid world. And then there's 10% that are fully remote. And if you look at who are fully remote, there's a lot of people by count. There's things like call centers, payroll, data entry, and there are some kind of elite coders, there's some journalists, there's a bunch of other people in that. But yeah, it's a great question. I'm showing the average over the whole population, but those numbers are really driven by that final 40%, of which 3/4 are hybrid and 1/4 are fully remote. So by 2025, where we are now, when you ask someone, do they work from home at all? If they say yes, typically they're hybrid. So a typical version would be Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in the office, Monday, Friday at home. That's kind of vanilla hybrid, and I'd say that's kind of quite common.
Thank you very much for this clarification. There's one other clarifying question that I'm going to ask, and then I let you go back to your presentation. So the Maria is asking about NGOs. Are they in your sample? Do we know anything about work from home for NGOs?
Yeah, so they are in our sample. We survey all sectors. I've spoken to at least a dozen or so NGOs. There's a big global charity I spoke to 2 or 3 times out of Ireland, Concern. Actually, fascinating, when I spoke to one that was operating out in Afghanistan, which I'll come back to later, actually. They said the only way we can employ women is if they're fully remote, because the Taliban has banned female employment. I've spoken to a lot of universities, research institutes, national labs, all kinds of weird things. They look, they're towards a higher level, because if you look at, it depends on the structure. Basically, if you have a lot of grads, graduate employees, kind of office workers tend to be hybrid. If you say have a lot of frontline employees that are out, imagine you're a homeless NGO, your frontline employees that are working directly with homeless, almost certainly going to be mostly, if not fully, in person. So it depends on the function. Just as another example, they're not quite an NGO, but an institution I know well, Stanford. So we have about 20,000 employees. About 10,000 of our employees are fully in person. So food service, cleaning, security, transport, all in person. There's about another 8,000 folks like me that are faculty and staff that are hybrid. So I always teach, in person. I'm right now at home. I'm not actually teaching today, and we have no research seminars, but I'm in 3 days a week. Same as with staff. And then we have about 2,000 fully remote employees. And who are they? They are people that are doing more back office stuff. So Iris and I were talking briefly before, but I have some research grants, and the person that helps me work on my research grant, I was emailing back and forth with him and asking him where he was, and he said Illinois. And I was like, Illinois, that's far from California, and he turns out to be fully remote. So that would actually be very typical for big companies. So if you went to look at, I haven't talked to them in detail, but I don't know, P&G, Unilever, Walmart, all of these big firms have a mix of in-person, some hybrid for professionals, and some back office fully remote.
I see. So a summary of what you just said might be, it depends much more on the type of work that you're doing, not so much the sector.
Exactly. Yeah, the sector, if you look at finance, you say tech, say Google. Google doesn't really have many frontline employees. I mean, it's mostly people coding in offices. That's why they're pretty fully remote. If you look at, say, Walmart, I think has 1 million employees in the US, of which probably 900,000 are in store. So they look more like fully in person just because they're a mix of employees.
Okay, well, thank you so much. There are a few other questions, but I will hold them because I have a feeling you'll tell us a bit more about how this pans out across different socioeconomic, demographic groups in your talk.
So there's so many facts, so why don't I go through, and I was happy to take more questions, and depends on where people are interested. I'll keep going, talk about managing it then.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
So how about, I'm going to hide the meeting control, so I'm going to see this. Here we go. So how about thoughts on managing it? So first thing is, for anyone who has to manage folks in this new world, it's actually really hard because employees have a huge spread of what they want. So about 20% of people never want to work from home. That's the top bar when you survey them. So we've been surveying thousands and thousands of people month in, month out. Who are these folks? They tend to be either people in their early 20s. So if I think of my undergrads, my two oldest kids are 19 and 21, they basically, typical 21-year-old wants to work from home maybe 1 or 0 days a week. When you poll them, they'll say, look, I want to go in to get mentored. I like the sociability of the office. And they'll also say, look, where am I going to work from home? I'm sharing an apartment with like 5 other people, and there's nowhere apart from my bedroom. There's a bigger group at the other extreme that want to work from home 5 days a week. If you look at who this group is, they tend to be people in their 30s and 40s with young kids. So imagine someone aged 38, has 2 young children, lives in a house, is, an hour from work. They may easily say, when you talk to them, look, I have a lot of social and connections at home, and I have, I'm pretty busy with my family and my work out of life, my kind of life out of work. And going in an hour each way to work is stressful, and it makes my life a lot harder, and I'd just rather work remotely. And then there's about 50% in the middle, which I think will probably include me, as I mentioned earlier, that have various versions of hybrid, and that's probably what they want to do. And that's the most common, but by certainly no means everyone. So first fact is kind of like air conditioning in the office. There is no one size fits all. Some people like it hotter, some like it colder. Same with work from home. And it makes it very hard to manage it because there's a big range of opinions. So what are the tips? Tip 1 would be, whatever you do, if you have a hybrid policy, it's worth coordinating at least within your group or office. So we surveyed people and we asked them, why do you want to work from home? And the main reason people say they want to work from home is to avoid the commute. It saves them a lot of time. We also asked them, why do you want to come in? And you notice that socializing and face-to-face collaboration are high. Face time with my manager is pretty low. The free pizza or donut or whatever is very, it doesn't even make the list here. So why would people voluntarily spend an hour and a half commuting in and out to go to the office, say, for 2 days a week? The reason is they want to see their colleagues. They want to collaborate in person. And so the big so what of this is it makes sense to coordinate. And it really makes sense to coordinate with folks in your group, in your office. So take me, I'm in the economics department. It clearly makes sense for me to coordinate with other people in the economics department. So when I come in there, we have meetings, we're together, we have seminars, we have lunch together. It's kind of feels lively and social. I don't tend to work much with folks in the English department. So in a sense, they could coordinate on a different cadence, and it would work fine for us to be different. So fact 1 is coordination is important, and it does need some central coordination. Typically what you see, as I mentioned to Iris, is folks typically come in on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and are mostly working from home on Monday, Friday. In fact, Friday was so quiet in London that London Underground defined it as an off-peak travel day. It was like the weekend. So few people were using Friday. So this is where we've ended up, an office use on commuting. It's busier midweek and quieter on Monday and Friday. And this is, vanilla hybrid. You're in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, you work from home Monday, Friday. The other so what that's come up a lot And actually, originally, this came up from a conversation with Marissa Mayer, who I interviewed about her experiences when she's CEO of Yahoo, was the importance of evaluating work from home employees based on performance, based on output or outcomes. So to explain, Iris is my manager. If we're in the office, she can see whether I'm sitting at my desk typing away. When she walks past my desk, she can see what's on my screen. Do I have, I don't know, Python, Excel, or Word up, or am I watching Netflix or Champions League or something? She has a rough idea from walking around, do I appear to be working? And this is not particularly great management. This is 5 out of 10. It's called management by walking around. But when I'm in the office, she can evaluate my input. The problem is if I'm now working remotely, I'm at home, let's say 2-3 days a week. On the days I'm at home, she can't see what I'm doing. And, of course, she could evaluate how quickly I reply to emails or respond to Slack messages, but that's really not a great way of, keeping tabs on somebody. And so in order to manage somebody that's working from home, you really need to switch to outcome or performance reviews. And it turns out this is typically better for both managers and employees. So it's better for Iris because she can say, hey, Nick, your roles are, let's say, teaching, research, and university service. I'm going to evaluate these. We're going to have feedback sessions. And, as long as you get them done, that's good. For me, it's a lot better because if I want to, go to the dentist or pick my kids up from school or, I don't know, go buy something in the morning, I can do that and make up for it in the evenings or possibly even the weekend. So the other big thing there's been a move towards, certainly in HR managers, increased focus on evaluating outputs and outcomes and less focus on just desk watching. So finally, what are 4 economic impacts? So there are many, there's like 8 or 9, including, one of them weirdly is a reduction on crime, and there's all kinds of things, but I'll go through kind of 4 that are kind of big picture and interesting, and at least one of them is clearly very gender related. So first effect that is probably pretty striking but noticeable, I'll just give you the numbers, is what's called the donut effect. So in the US, and in fact globally, we have some global data on this, a huge number of people have left city centers and gone out to suburbs. So this is a picture for New York. This is from a paper we had come out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and we see about 1 million people have left big US city centers and gone out to the suburbs. Why is that? Yeah, it's very intuitive. If I work in a Goliath National Bank and in 2019 I had to come in 5 days a week, now I've got to come in 3. I'm thinking I'd like a bit more space at home for a home office, but I'm less bothered about a long commute or maybe a backyard for my kids to play in. And so folks have moved out in large numbers, but to the suburbs of pretty much the same cities they lived in pre-pandemic. And anyone that owns property has seen rents in the suburbs, property prices in the suburbs have gone up a lot more on average than city centers. Big question. It's an interesting question about what happens to offices. You hear a lot of people complaining deeply about offices, like, oh, the office sector's, dismal, these things are worthless now. Interestingly, it depends very much on when the office was built. So I'll give you 2 examples. Top left is the iconic Flatiron building in New York. So that was built in 1913. That is an example of a skinny kind of pre-World War II, pre-1914 building, which was built in an era where there wasn't electricity. So the Flatiron building, when it was built in 1913, you would light up offices using daylight. So they didn't, there was no electricity back then that could light up entire offices. And so as a result, they're tall and thin with lots of windows. This converts very easily to condos. And indeed, the Flatiron building right now is being converted to a bunch of apartments with a luxury hotel. So those buildings have not really suffered. If office tenants don't want them, they convert them to, expensive apartments and hotels, for example. Bottom right is the kind of building that's really suffering. These are built after World War II, and these are these big, kind of ugly box-like buildings. So this is on the right is 50 California Street. This building is a bit of a nightmare. So this thing is, 25% empty. It's hard to get tenants in it. People are, vacating offices. What are you going to do about it? Well, you can't really convert this to apartments. Each floor has 20,000 square feet. There's not nearly enough windows. There's not nearly enough bathrooms. What else? It's very hard to do anything with these buildings. And a lot of them are just sitting empty, kind of problems in city centers. I show this building because this building is actually famous. It was featured in a 2014 film, Godzilla. And in the film, Godzilla throws like the bad monster thing called Mutu, I think, into the building. The building collapses and kills the beast. So that's potentially the best use of some of these buildings right now, is killing a kind of mutant beast. But, it highlights city centers, the way they're affected depends very much on the age of buildings. Second fact is work from homes having a big impact on labor supply, particularly expanding very positively labor supply, particularly female employment. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is less of an issue in the US, Canada, and Northern Europe. We do see, and I'll show you a bit later, female employment in the US has gone up a little bit versus male employment. The differences aren't huge. There are, though, enormous differences in other countries. I'm going to show you 3 examples. So bottom left is from one of my students, Sahani Jalota. So with 2 co-authors, she ran an amazing randomized control trial, an A/B test out in Mumbai. And what she did is she set up jobs and she randomized 2 things. One is whether you could work from home on the job or had to come into the office. And the second is how much you were paid. And the variation in hourly salary was up to two times difference. What she found is when you look at men, they basically would go for whichever paid the most. So men didn't seem to care whether the job was at home or in the office. They basically just wanted the highest rate per hour. If you looked in Mumbai and looked at female employees, they had a massive preference to work from home. And this is what you can see in the figure on the left. Take up for women for these jobs is twice as much as they're working from home versus in the office. And Sahani and her co-authors, Anahita and Lisa, said, look, in the context for women going to work, there's assault risk on public transit, there's sexism at work, there's issues on kind of culture and husbands kind of trying to prevent their wives from working. And so in this context, being able to work from home has a huge increase on a huge positive impact on female labor supply. There is another study on the right that builds on some of the stuff that Claudia Goldin and others have looked at, which is what's called the female employment penalty. So there are many studies that look at what happens after women give birth in terms of hours worked and income. And for men, typically after birth, you see in European or US tax records, income's relatively flat. For women, you see a big drop, some recovery, but you get left with this long run gap. And so having childbirth in Europe and the US for sure is associated with quite permanent, what's called employment penalties. These studies, there are 2 different studies, one in the US, one actually in South America, showing work from home reduces these employment penalties by a third. So it doesn't get rid of it. But what it suggests, in the papers, if you read them, say, look, if you're working from home, it's easier to re-enter, to go back to work with childcare versus you have to go into the office 5 days a week. Finally, there's a study in Turkey I'm involved in with a number of co-authors where we're looking actually at a call center. And the call center early in the pandemic shifted to fully remote from being fully in person and has remained fully remote ever since. And they saw numerous changes, including actually increased performance. So actually in call centers, fully remote employees were higher performing than in-person employees. They also saw much higher numbers employment of female agents, of actually married women, folks from smaller towns, educated employees. So it really changes the demographic. On the left, you can see pre-pandemic, when you had to come in the office, 50% of the employees were men, 50% were women. When you can go to fully remote, it's heading up towards almost 80% of the employees are female. And when you interview the company, they say there is, a large number of women that would like to work, but coming in 5 days a week is hard, but working from home makes that much more feasible. So that's fact 2. It's increased female labor supply, but particularly in kind of middle and lower income countries. Fact 3 is it's also increased labor supply, again, in an incredibly positive way, possibly the most positive story from the whole surge in work from home for individuals with a disability. So in the US, there's about 30 million Americans that have a disability. They tend to be, the average age of these folks is 50, 55. I'm 51, so it's like very much, my age and above. If you look at what it is, it's folks with back issues, vision issues, hearing issues, kind of ambulatory issues. Of those 30 million people, pre-pandemic, only about 6 million of them worked. So they had a very low rate of employment, much lower than the rest of the population. And in a sense, it's bad for these individuals, and it's also bad for society as a whole, because these are people that, could be working, paying taxes, with the given current deficit, that would be clearly extremely positive. What we see is post-pandemic employment of Americans with a disability is surging. It's rising very rapidly. And in fact, you can see, I have a paper that's coming out in the American Economic Review Insights, shows A, this is due to work from home, and B, it's very strikingly there in if you split labor force by disability. So this splits the labor force by with and without a disability, by gender. So here you can see women have seen slightly higher employment rates than men. Age, education, race is slightly higher employment rates for non-white than white, and nativity. You can see on this split, employment of Americans with a disability has seen a very rapid increase versus the rest of the labor force. And, it's one of the very positive, good news stories. To explain what's going on, maybe it's pretty intuitive, but I've interviewed probably about a dozen individuals with a disability. And I think one of them that was most striking is I interviewed someone about 2 months ago that was disabled from the neck down. They were mid-30s. They were pretty senior in marketing, and they had a bad car accident, and from the accident become disabled from the neck down. And they said, look, when I have to go into the office, it takes me 3 hours to get in. They said my carer has to come and get me out of bed, wash me, get me dressed, take me to the car. Then my father comes and he drives me to the office, and then the reverse happens at the end of the day. The person I was talking to said, when I'm at home, I can get out and get into bed and work from home. I can do that in about 20 minutes. And they said, look, I'm currently hybrid. I'm coming into the office 2 days a week, working from home 3 days a week. That works great. But if I had to go in 5 days a week, I wouldn't work. It'd just be too hard. I had to get up at 5 a.m. to go into the office if I have to go in. So this story is repeated over and over again with folks with a disability, that being able to work from home makes it much easier for them to work. Finally, I end on golf. I don't actually play golf, but I heard so many people mention the impact of working from home on golf, and I use this as kind of an analogy for a bigger finding. So we collected data from satellites and GPS data on how many people are playing golf on which days. And what you see is pre-pandemic golf is basically a Saturday, Sunday activity. During the pandemic and post-pandemic, golf courses have just been jammed every day throughout the day, basically because people are working from home and they seem to be able to slip out during the day to have a game of golf. Now, this is 7 days a week. This is Wednesday, the middle of the working week. You see that pre-pandemic, people would play golf in the morning and then head into work, or maybe at the end of the day. During the pandemic, it's pretty much peaked all day. It drops in the middle of the afternoon because this is August, and in the South, it's just too hot to play. But when you talk to folks, we interviewed a few folks running golf courses, and they're saying it's just insane. Golf courses are now jammed all day, every day. I put this up to highlight two things. One is, this is true for golf. It's going to be true for much larger parts of the leisure economy. So think of, pickleball gyms, hair salons, dentists, shopping malls, anything that used to be pushed into the evenings on the weekend. Now this activity spread throughout the week. These sectors are booming, and it's changed peak loading in a very positive way. So offices have crushed into 3 days a week, Tuesday to Thursday. That's kind of inefficient and problematic. Parts of the leisure economy are spread out, which is much better. Second finding is evaluation tools. You want to make sure, look, if you have an employee, they play golf between 9 and 11 in the morning on a Wednesday. That's fine, but they just need to get their job done, which probably means work a bit in the evening. So to end, where are we heading? Why is this glorious? What about the future? We've been collecting data on work from home going back to 1965. This is a log scale. So the straight line tells you it's kind of continuous growth. It's been doubling roughly every 15 years. The reason is the technology has got better and better and better over time. So I'm one of 4 children. Both my parents worked. So I remember growing up in the UK and kind of when I was a kid in the 80s. And I've talked to my mum and dad about what happened when one of us was sick, or, there was a tube strike or something, and, we couldn't go in. And my parents would say, look, one of us would have to work from home. They said in the 80s, it was terrible. It's like carrying pieces of paper. You'd have to phone into work. You felt really disconnected. Phone calls were really expensive. So work from home was really bad in the 80s. Technology got better in the 90s with the personal computer. We got one in my house, an old Amstrad green screen, in I think 95. By 2000, you had the internet. 2010, you have video calls and cloud. Basically, technology is getting better and better. And so if you predict 5 and certainly 10 years out, the technology for work from home is going to be far better. So we're going to have huge, probably wall-sized screens. You're going to see someone's whole body. There's going to be better audio, video connectivity. And that's going to mean in the long run, work from home rates are clearly going to go up. So My prediction is kind of a Nike swoosh. We saw a drop from 2021, 22. 23, 24, 25, 26 is probably going to be flat, 27, but at some point work from home is slowly going to climb. So if you're trying to predict out for your organization 5 or certainly 10 years out, I think it's pretty clear work from home is going to rise. So to conclude, it's here to stay. It's typically 2-3 days a week. Managing it is hard. I think it needs coordination. And as I mentioned, I think it's had, particularly beneficial effects on female employees, particularly actually in middle and lower income countries, and also on Americans with a disability. I'll stop now. Just to say, I'll put the slides in the chat. If anyone would like to have a copy, you're more than welcome.
Thank you so much, Nick. I don't know we can put it in the chat because people can only access the Q&A, but I'm sure our team can help people find access to the, oh, here we go. Oh, no, we have it. We got it.
Yeah,
oh, perfect.
Feel free. If you don't get it, feel free to send me an email.
No, it's here. Super, super. Oh, wonderful. So here we go. So we just, thank you so much, Nick. I mean, what a wealth of information. We see it also in the number of questions. I have a number of questions as well, but I just wanted to let you know, we're just thrilled to have you with us because you really are the preeminent authority on this question. So now people have a number of questions. One is related to race and ethnicity, including the intersection of, and you showed us some data there before that really there wasn't such a huge difference, it looked like, but is there anything particularly for Black women, women of color, that might be different from the rest?
A little bit. So we have, there's so many results I didn't go through. There is a little bit of an effect by race. I'll give you a slightly broader take on it, actually. So we surveyed in 2 or 3 months, we asked people, basically a question on them. We didn't call it minority. We said, are more than 10% of your co-workers in the same race, age bin, religion, politics, and gender? And what you find is folks that report they're a minority, as in less than 10% of their co-workers or any of those bins, have a slightly higher preference to work from home. And if you're a multiple, it's particularly high. And so from interview, I mean, the interviewing is slightly less systematic, but I'm 51. If I'm in an office full of 20, I mean, I'm not going to be a minority of most of those, but if I'm in an office, say, of 20-year-olds, they don't need to be aggressive towards me. They're just all talking about, I don't know, TikTok and something I don't understand. And so it makes it slightly less appealing for me to come in. You can see why, if you're the only Black person in an office full of white, the only Democrats and Republicans, or, so in general, you find that full 5-day return to offices push back a little bit on diversity in workplaces. So I'm not particularly suggesting fully remote, but certainly hybrid is one way to support diversity in workplaces.
Thank you so much. Somebody also, I'm just going to go back here to Renata's question, was raising something that I've also heard or read, not heard, read about in the media, and that is, the fairness question of some of us being able to work from home and others not able to work from home, including in your university, my university. So how should we think about this?
Again, it's a really great question. It's come up a lot. So I must, I probably at this point spoken to more than 1,000 managers, organizations. This does come up and it's an important issue. What's happened, interestingly enough, is if you look in the labor market, folks that can work from home, so probably most listeners, most graduates, they've seen their wages go up by less than people that can't. So another number that's really worthwhile knowing is when we surveyed America, we've done this internationally for about 50,000 people. We asked them, how much is hybrid worth to you in terms of pay? And the number you get is between 5 to 10%, with an average of about 8%. So the average person would say, look, I'd kind of indifferent between working from home 2 to 3 days a week and having 8% less versus having to go in all 5 days. And if you do the maths, that saves you an enormous amount of time, and people really dislike commuting. So then you're right. It seems very unfair that grads and professionals, get to work from home. Oddly enough, from 2020 till now, we've seen that graduate employees have seen their wages go up by about 10% less than by frontline employees. So we know that inequality rose tremendously from 1980 to 2019. There's many, many studies. David Deming, who I know is, core person at Harvard Kennedy School, has done work on this. He's seen a big rise in inequality. From 2020 to 2023, it went down a bit, by about 10%. And it seems what's going on is the labor market's kind of adjusted. So it's less positive, you know, it's less nice to have to go in every day. If it's hybrid, it's more appealing. So take at Stanford, my salary's gone up. I'm not complaining. I mean, I'm clearly paid well compared to frontline staff, but it's gone up by less than inflation. We've had more generous pay offers for frontline staff. So yes, we have got a perk that they haven't got. Oddly enough, the labor market's kind of compensated that to offset it. So, you know, the only other solution I can tell you is, oddly enough, one of the biggest 4-day-a-week employers, which is slightly different from working from home in the US, the largest is Amazon. And what they do is they allow warehouse workers to come in for 4 days for 10 hours rather than 5 days for 8. So the other way, for certain in-person roles, or you can do 3 for 13 hours, you can have some flexibility. But primarily what's happened is the labor market has pushed down salaries of graduates a little bit and pushed up salaries of frontline workers. And you can see it. If you go to the shopping center, you see, you know, McDonald's will have job postings and Google's not hiring. And, you know, this is kind of what's driving part of this.
Very interesting. We actually in the book also discuss a fast food chain, which does something very similar, giving people options of how they want to work, you know, in person, like 3 days a week, longer hours, 5 days, shorter hours, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's some hope there, even though we would all agree we feel slightly uncomfortable that some of us can afford this, but economists have such a beautiful word for this, compensating differentials that the market will eventually, right, kind of adjust.
It's worth about 8%. So it is
8%.
And so oddly enough, you see that, you know, David Alton co-authors have this stuff looking at labor market changes, and you see that college graduate salaries have gone up by about 10% less than non-grads since 2020. So that's almost exactly offset that.
Right.
So yeah, I'll stop there. But yes, it's kind of fixed it through the market, but it's hard for individual employers beyond doing, as you mentioned, shift changing to address it directly.
Yeah. Interesting. No, thank you. So then a number of questions, and Tammy, I think, started that thread around AI. Do you know anything already on how this is going to affect work from home? Is that just along the lines of more technology making it easier, or what else are you seeing?
I think the one thing that's easy to predict is I think AI is going to be a threat more to fully remote jobs than hybrid jobs. So if you think of, you know, I mentioned there are 10% of Americans roughly that are working fully remotely right now, and there's roughly 180 million working Americans. So you're looking at almost 20 million people. Most of them are actually, you know, Airbnb coders, you know, journalists, etc. Nowhere near them. You know, the majority of these in call centers, data entry, payroll, etc. Much of that activity in the long run is actually at risk from AI, or even offshoring, actually moved to, you know, Central South America, to Asia, etc. So I think if we're looking 5 to 10 years out, what we may see is the number of people that are fully remote may actually drop. The number of people who are hybrid will go up quite a lot. And the number of people that are fully in person may also drop as well. So the last category is less obvious, but I'll give you 2 great examples of how fully in person jobs are kind of morphing into hybrid. So kind of high skill and a low skill version. The high skill version is my neighbor across the road. She's a physician, and she now sees patients on Zoom 1 day a week. And it turns out she's happy to do it. And the patients are often happy because they want, you know, a blood pressure test back or prescription renewal, etc. And so that's, you know, one thing whereby versus 5 days in person pre-pandemic, it's now hybrid. Another example, which I think is amazing, is fast food. So you'd think that fast food couldn't possibly have anyone working fully remote. Well, it turns out if you go to a drive-through McDonald's and you drive in and you push your window down, and there's that little booth thing, you shout into that kind of loud, it looks like a microphone, and you say, I don't know, I want a Big Mac and fries, whatever you're ordering. The person taking that order in 2019 used to be in the cabin 20 foot in front of you, and they'd type it up and they'd pass it over to the cook and they'd serve it to you. Now the person taking that order is in like in Mississippi, because it's much cheaper to have order takers, and they still type it in and it still gets processed to the person cooking 20 foot in front of you. But that one role of listening to customers' orders has gone to fully remote. And so what you see is there's little bits of roles and jobs. You know, the other day, my friend was saying they went into the dentist and the receptionist was just a big iPad screen and the receptionist wasn't there. I was kind of surprised. But so what we're seeing is hybrids expanding. AI maybe is a bit of a threat to fully remote, and fully in person tends to be shrinking a bit as people manage to make these roles more remote.
Thank you so much. So then we have a question that goes back, I presume, to the India study that you presented, which I thought was so fascinating, where you find big gender differences in working from home. And the question is, I don't know, we know the answer, but it's an interesting question. How might this affect gender norms? So are we just basically replicating gender norms now? Women, instead of not working, they do work, but they work from home, but they therefore have maybe no career advancement opportunities? Or are we thinking not working, but then working from home is already an advance because in closing some of those gaps?
Great question. It's what Sahani, Lisa, and Coulthers were like looking to try. They have Sahani and Lisa have a set. They have two papers between them, and one of the questions exactly on this: what's the longer run impact? And to summarize what I remember from this, the longer run impact is after the experiment ends, they follow these folks up, and you see persistently higher levels of employment amongst women, including some people that are now moving on to in-person jobs. So what's the dynamic going on? The dynamic is their explanation for a lot of it is these are kind of middle to lower income families. The husband apparently doesn't want to be seen to be inadequate because he's not providing for the family. So he's kind of embarrassed about having a working wife. But the wife works, gets income. As a family, they appreciate it and think, hey, wait, this income's really very valuable. I guess you get locked into higher spending. And then, this is a new norm. And of course, it will spill over to other people in the housing compounds, et cetera. And so what they see is it has permanently increased labor supply. So in that sense, I think it's a very positive thing. It's not just these jobs are only fully remote and they're only hidden at home. Once you have the higher income, you start spending it, you get adjusted. When that job goes away and you find other jobs. So they actually increase long run employment to in-person jobs. So it's not only directly positive for them, but I think it's helping change social norms as well.
Thank you. Thank you. So then we have another question here about best practices on maintaining, boosting work from home productivity. You showed us, some data already on how we might be able to do better, more coordination, other types of interventions. And I think the question is now, can we link those to productivity when working from home?
Yes, I think the best way to have, I'm going to focus, this fully remote is somewhat different from hybrid. So if you look at fully remote, there are certain roles that are actually much more productive fully remote. So I have some studies. I mentioned the one in Turkey on call centers. I have one in China. Call centers, interestingly enough, for a role that's actually more productive at home. And the reason is you sit with a headset on, and the big problem with productivity is background noise, and it's quieter at home typically, and also taking breaks, turning up for work late. So there are some roles that are just full stop more productive at home. For hybrid, it tends to be dependent on the task. So Iris, if we're working together and we're having meetings, it's useful sometimes to have meetings in person, particularly if you're my manager, there may be some mentoring or there are larger meetings or lunch. For other things like reading, writing, quiet analysis, discussions with other offices, it turns out that can be equally well done at home. And if you're working at home, you don't have to commute. So generally what you see on productivity is if you, one, coordinate, and two, kind of do the obvious sensible stuff of the days you're in the office, if that's say Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, that's all meetings, lunches, presentations, trainings. That seems to, on average, actually increase overall productivity because the quiet stuff you push to Monday, Friday, you didn't need to be in the office. There's no difference. But now you're saving that hour and a half commute and it's actually quieter. And so I think well-organized hybrid can actually boost productivity overall. So not only are employees happier because they save a lot of time, but the firm is happier because productivity goes up and turnover goes down. But I think a lot of it's just about being organized. It's like all of, I've been working in management for a long time. And it's really about being methodical and collecting data and being organized. And that the problem was that didn't happen in May 2020 or April 2020. It was like a crazy rush to go home. And so it gave it a bit of a bad name because it was under horrible, strain situated circumstances. Whereas now we have time to step back and think and plan this properly.
Right. This is Mike, you did some of this work really early on, right? 2010 or even earlier, you did your first randomized control trial on hybrid work. I just wanted to remind people, this didn't just start with COVID. Of course, COVID was an enormous shock, but some organizations had done this before.
Yeah, totally. So I first started collecting data in 2005. I got interested in it because of my mom and dad. I remember, I was talking earlier, I remember us as a kid, my mom or dad, they kind of would use up all their holidays and sick leave to stay home, look after us. I also links to maternity pay. My wife we had 2 kids in the UK and then came over here, and I noticed huge differences across employers and the countries. You know, the US is much less generous on maternity pay. The work goes back much further. There's a famous person called Jack Nilles that actually wrote a paper in 1973. So that was, you know, in his paper, he mentioned the word telecommuting. And I've talked to him a couple of times. He's still around. He's maybe 91 now. And the issues in his paper is so true to today. It's amazing what he talks about. But back then it was about telephoning stuff in. But yeah, there's been a long running theme. I actually got to meet Barack Obama and Joe Biden in 2014 at an event at the White House on this Working Family Summit because of that randomized control trial. But I have to say, when you talk to people about work from home before 2020, it was a quiet topic. You know, suddenly their eyelids would start to like, you know, it was like hard to engage people. And then suddenly in March 2020, obviously it just exploded because suddenly we were all forced to do it. You know, generally at this point now, it seems like most of us are probably going to be hybrid. It's harder now in 2025 to have fully remote jobs. They exist. There are definitely, you know, 10% of people are fully remote, but certainly hybrid is massively better than what we had. Big thing is like, that Nature paper shows it's profitable to be hybrid. Like you can make money, and often if you tell CEOs it's profitable to do something, it's the best, you know, persuasion on it. And B, I think the best way to have hybrid staying there is to make it successful. So I kind of think it actually makes sense to have 3 days a week, to stick to those mandates, to come in on those days. Because otherwise, the other thing I've heard from a lot of CEOs is they'll say, hey, people aren't coming in on the 3 days I want, so I'm going to go to 5 and expect people to come in on 3. So if you can make 3 work, that will stick, and we get those 2 days to, you know, forever.
Out of time, I have one last question here that I'm going to pick of the many that are remaining. And you might not be able to answer it, but you might be able to point people to some resources. This is about performance evaluations. You mentioned it a little bit in passing, but people are concerned about, any advice on how to make this work, remote, in office, hybrid, any good practice that you've seen?
Well, yeah, the Society of Human Resource Managers has a bunch of stuff on it. It's really focused on outcomes and achievements. And, you know, I don't know. I'm not the expertise on it, but, you know, for me personally, I have 3 tasks really. I teach, I do research, and I do university service. So good performance management would look at all 3 of them, would have a fair assessment, would collect data from multiple individuals, would have a time frame. It wouldn't be one number or one person, because then, you know, you're potentially the victim of some, you know, horrible boss if it's just one person. So ideally you crowdsource. So I'll stop there, but it is the problem with it is it takes time. A good performance evaluation system is quite time intensive, and it may not have been worth it in 2019. It may be you just desk watch and you get away with it. As soon as you go hybrid, it's basically very hard to manage people at home, and so performance evaluation becomes particularly valuable.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, in many ways, I interpret your answer as saying good advice is not so different from, you know, 5 years ago when you weren't working in hybrid format as much. You should always have focus on more objective data and outcomes and different persons' perceptions. So with that, thank you so much, Nick. This was an incredible feast, I think, for all of us here participating in the seminar. We learned a lot. I'm just suggesting to the team and that we can maybe save the Q&A and questions. I can share them with Nick, because including some people shared some information on companies, other places that you might find relevant. So hopefully we can do that and share that with you. But unfortunately, you won't hear our applause, but thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you who joined us. We will have another seminar next week that's going to focus on career equity, career advancement, and we'll be joined by Professor of Economics Latan Gangaran from the University of Monash University in Australia. And with that, Nick, thanks so much. And everyone have a good rest of your day.